A little before midnight on Saturday, the 7th of December, 1811, a servant girl named Margaret Jewell was sent out into the London dark to buy oysters. She did not know it, but that errand was about to save her life and leave her with a thing she would carry to the end of it. The mistress of the house had lately given birth and was still weak, and oysters were thought a delicacy fit to tempt a recovering woman's appetite. So the master handed the girl some money and sent her out to fetch them and to settle a small account at the baker's on the way. It was the ordinary business of a busy household closing down for the night. Margaret stepped out of the lit shop into the cold, and behind her the door was shut, and the life she had known ended without her being in the room to see it go. The oyster shop was closed. She tried another. That too was dark. She went on to the baker's and found it shut as well, and so she turned back toward the house with the money still in her hand and the errand unfinished, a small failure of no consequence that she would replay for the rest of her days. It was now past 20 minutes after midnight. She came up to the door of the shop at number 29, and she knocked and no one came. Tonight we revisit one case that entered the permanent record of English fear and never truly left it, and forced a nation to admit it had no one standing between its people and the dark. 4 lives one household, one night of work that changed how a country chose to guard itself. The case of Timothy Marr begins on the Ratcliff Highway in the east of London in the last month of 1811. The Ratcliff Highway was a road that ran through the beating heart of the world's greatest port. This was Wapping, hard against the London docks, where the wealth of an empire came ashore, and the men who carried it lived packed into a warren of lanes and courts and lodging-houses. Ships from every ocean lay in the river, and the streets smelled of tar and salt and rope and the exhalations of the tanneries. It was a place of sailors between voyages, of dock labourers and slop-sellers and publicans, of foreign tongues and short tempers and money that came and went in a single night. Along the highway itself the shop fronts stood shoulder to shoulder, tradesmen serving the endless traffic of a maritime city that never entirely slept. Wealth and poverty lived within arm's reach of one another here. The respectable shopkeeper and the destitute seaman, divided by nothing more than a pane of glass and a bolted door. And in that world, a bolted door was the only protection a family had. There was no police force. I want you to hold that fact still for a moment, because everything that follows grows from it. In 1811, the city of London, the largest city on the face of the earth, was guarded by nothing more than a scattering of elderly parish watchmen, the men they called Charlies, who carried a lantern and a rattle and called the hours through the streets. There were no detectives. There was no force to summon, no number to call, no organized body of men whose work was the prevention of crime. When darkness fell, a household drew its own bolts and trusted to its own walls and hoped. Behind the door of number 29 lived a young man in a hurry to rise in the world. His name was Timothy Marr, and he was somewhere around 24 years of age. He had not been born to the shopkeeping life. He had gone to sea, serving several years with the East India Company aboard a trading ship called the Dover Castle, sailing the long routes to the east and back, the making of a young man of the age who had ambition and no inheritance. But Marr had come ashore with a plan. He had saved and he had married, and in April of that year, 1811, he had taken the lease on the shop at number 29 Ratcliff Highway and set himself up as a linen draper and hosier, a seller of fine cloth and stockings, and the small drapery of respectable life. It was a bold reach for a former seaman. Everything he had was in it. Think about the distance he had travelled to reach that shop door. A young man of no fortune had signed on to an East Indiaman and given years of his life to the brutal discipline of the long-haul trade, the disease and the storms and the hard shipboard justice that such a life meant. All of it endured for the wages that might one day buy him something on solid ground. He had made those voyages. He had kept the money instead of drinking it in a Wapping tavern, which alone set him apart from half the seamen on the highway. He had found a wife willing to build alongside him, and he had put every shilling of it into a lease on the Ratcliff Highway, wagering the whole of his sea-bought savings that he could turn himself from a sailor into a shopkeeper, from a man who served on another man's ship into a man who owned his own door. In April he had opened it. By December he had a shop, a wife, and a son. He had done it. He had actually managed the thing that almost no one who started where he started ever managed to do. He had 8 months to enjoy it. He did not reach alone. Marr had a young wife, Celia, and by that December she had given him a son. The child was named Timothy after his father, and he was 14 weeks old, born at the end of August, still at the age when a baby is more promise than person. The house was completed by 2 more souls who belonged to it in the way that servants and apprentices belonged to a family business in that age, sharing its roof and its work and, as it turned out, its fate. There was an apprentice boy, James Gowan, a lad learning the draper's trade under Marr, and there was Margaret Jewell, the servant girl, the one now standing in the cold outside a door that would not open. Consider Celia Marr for a moment, because she is the easiest of the 4 to overlook, and she should not be. She was a young wife who had come to this precarious new venture at her husband's side, and 14 weeks before that December night she had done the most dangerous thing a woman of her age was routinely asked to do. She had given birth in an era when childbed killed mothers as a matter of ordinary course, and she had come through it alive. She was still recovering. Her body was still mending. That is the whole reason the oysters were sent for. Her husband, working himself half to death to build them a future, had thought in the middle of his busiest night about his tired wife and wanted to bring her some small comfort to the end of a hard week. It is a tender detail, the kind that makes a household real rather than a line in a coroner's report, and it is the very detail that carried Margaret Jewell out of that house at the one moment in the whole of her life that it mattered. Boss, Celia Marr's weakness after childbirth is the reason the servant girl lived. Her recovery bought another woman's survival and could not buy her own. Picture the 5 of them on that Saturday night, because Saturday night was not a night of rest for a shopkeeper. It was the busiest night of the trading week, and the Marrs kept their shop open late to catch the wages of a labouring district on its one flush evening. When at last they closed the shutters, the work was not done. There was the shop to set right, the stock to order, the day's takings to reckon. Timothy Marr was a man building something, and men building something work late. So near midnight the master was still on his feet, and the apprentice with him, and somewhere close the young mother tended the 14-week-old child, and the whole small enterprise was still awake and in motion when the master sent the servant out for oysters to tempt his tired wife. That is the picture. A young family at the end of a long working day, the shop quiet, the baby fretting, a treat sent for. Hold that picture. It is the last one there is. Before we cross that threshold, let me say plainly what kind of people these were, because it matters to what the city felt afterward. This was not a den of vice. This was not the underworld turning on itself, the sort of killing a comfortable public could file away as the natural end of dangerous lives. Timothy Marr was the opposite of that. He was thrift and ambition and respectability, a young man doing everything the age told a young man to do, working himself toward a better station one late Saturday at a time, and his wife was a new mother, and their child was 3 months old, and the boy in the shop was an apprentice barely into his teens. If you find value in these lives being remembered as they were lived, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. Margaret Jewell stood at the door and knocked, and the sound went into a house that had gone wrong. She waited. She knocked again. And then, in the stillness, she heard sounds from within that she would try to describe for the rest of her life and never quite manage. She thought she heard a footstep on the stair, coming down toward the door. She thought she heard the low cry of the baby, and then nothing came to the door at all. The footstep did not turn into a hand on the bolt. The child's cry was not answered by any adult voice. She stood in the cold with the unbought oysters undone and a growing dread she could not name, and she began to knock in earnest, harder and harder, and still the door did not open. A neighbor, roused, would later say she was slamming the knocker against the wood with what he called unintermitting violence. She had begun to understand, without yet knowing anything, that something on the other side of that door was profoundly and terribly wrong. A watchman came, one of the parish Charlies, drawn by the noise, and a neighbor came, a pawnbroker named John Murray, who lived next door and had heard earlier sounds he had not liked and had done nothing about, as people do. Now Murray climbed over the low fence at the back and let himself in through the rear of the premises, and he carried a light through the Marrs' house from the back toward the front, and in the space of a few feet he passed out of the ordinary world and into the other one. He found the apprentice boy first. James Gowan lay just inside the shop near the door, and his head had been beaten in with such force that the blood had been thrown up onto the shop's counter and even to the ceiling. A few feet on lay Celia Marr face down, her skull crushed. Near the counter was Timothy Marr himself, the young draper who had reached so far and worked so late, beaten to death where he had stood. Murray got the front door open, and Margaret Jewell, still on the step, learned in that instant that the house she had left an hour before was a slaughterhouse. And then, when they went to the child, they found the worst of it, the detail that would drive a city out of its senses. The infant Timothy, 14 weeks old, still in his cradle, had been struck so hard that one side of his small face was destroyed, and his throat had been cut so deeply that the head was very nearly severed from the body. The killer had crossed the room to the cradle. He had looked at a sleeping 3-month-old child, and he had done that for people. A young tradesman, his wife, their baby, and an apprentice boy, killed inside their own bolted door on an ordinary Saturday night. In the space of the few minutes it took a servant to fail to buy oysters. "'Cause I need you to stay with me here." Because what happened next tells you as much about the age as the murders themselves. Before we follow the hunt for the man who did this, I want you to sit for a moment with the sheer defenselessness of it. 4 lives ended in minutes with no force in all of London whose duty it was to answer, and I would ask you, if this account is holding you, to share it forward, because these 4 have been reduced too often to a single lurid headline, and they were more than that. Now let us see what the killing did to the greatest city on earth. It undid it. When the nature of the murders became known, and the newspapers of the following week carried every detail across the capital and then across the country, London descended into a state of terror that is difficult now to imagine. This was not the ordinary crime of a violent district. A whole respectable family, a baby among them, had been destroyed in their own home behind a locked door, apparently by an intruder who came in, killed everyone, and left. And the motive made it worse, because there seemed to be no motive at all. Money was found in the house untouched. £152 sat undisturbed in a drawer in the bedroom, a substantial sum, more than a labourer might see in years, and the killer had not taken it. If a man would butcher an entire household and walk past a fortune, to do it, then no lock was strong enough and no family was safe, because such a man could not be reasoned with or predicted or bought off. Every householder in London lay awake listening to the ordinary creaks of the night and heard a footstep on the stair. The writer Thomas de Quincey, who lived through the panic and never shook it off, would set down years afterward that the whole nation had been thrown into a frenzy of terror by these killings, that people spoke of little else, that the murders carried a kind of terrible completeness that fixed itself in the mind and would not be dislodged. He was not reaching for effect. The letters and diaries of the period record the same thing in plainer words. Doors that had stood unlocked for years were bolted now. Strangers were watched on the road. The sale of watchmen's rattles and iron bolts and firearms climbed across the capital. A single unknown hand had reached into the most private place a family owns, the space behind their own front door, and had shown 1,000,000 households that the lock they trusted every night of their lives was no protection at all against a man who simply did not care whether he was caught. And then, 12 days later, it happened again. On the 19th of December, less than half a mile from the Marr's shop, at a public house called the King's Arms in New Gravel Lane, a second family was destroyed. The publican, a man named John Williamson, his wife Elizabeth, and their servant were killed in the same manner, with the same appalling violence, throats cut and skulls broken. This time there was a survivor and a witness of a kind, a lodger who escaped by knotting sheets and climbing from an upper window, half-dressed into the street, screaming that they were murdering the people in the house. Now the terror had a pattern. Now it was not a single unrepeatable horror, but a campaign, a thing that came back, and the panic that had gripped Wapping seized the whole of London and beyond. People bought locks and bolts and weapons. Householders barricaded their doors. The demand went up louder than it had ever been for someone, anyone, to be caught, and beneath that demand ran a deeper and more dangerous question that the authorities had no answer for. Who exactly was supposed to catch him? There was no one whose job it was. What passed for an investigation was run by the local magistrates and the parish authorities, men with no training and no method, offering rewards and rounding up the usual suspects, which in Wapping meant foreign sailors, of whom the docks were full. Dozens were detained on no better grounds than that they had blood on their clothes, which in a district of dockworkers and slaughtermen and seamen meant very little, and the one piece of hard evidence sat in plain view the whole time, because the killer had left his weapon behind. In the Marr's bedroom, leaning against a chair, stood a shipwright's maul, a heavy, long-handled hammer of the kind used in the dockyards, its blood-matted head still bearing human hair. And into the handle of that maul were punched a set of initials. They read as an I and a P, or perhaps a J and a P. That maul was the closest thing the age had to a fingerprint, and for weeks the authorities could make nothing of it, because there was no system, no register, no organized means of tracing a tool to its owner across a city of 1,000,000 souls. There were other traces, and every one of them deepened the confusion rather than resolving it. A second tool, a long ripping chisel of the sort used to prise apart a ship's timbers, was found in the house, though it appeared to have taken no part in the killing. 2 sets of bloody footprints, tracked through carpenter's sawdust, led away from the premises toward Pennington Street, which suggested to some that more than one man had stood inside that shop. A passerby reported having seen a number of men, perhaps as many as 10, running from the direction of the highway toward New Gravel Lane shortly after the alarm was raised. Was it one killer or a gang? The evidence pointed both ways at once, and the men trying to read it had no training in reading evidence of any kind. They were shopkeepers and parish officers, pressed into a task that no one had ever taught them to perform, standing over a maul and a chisel and a set of footprints and doing little more than guessing. Attention settled at last on a lodger at a public house called the Pear Tree in Cinnamon Street, off the highway. His name was John Williams, though he sometimes went by other names, and he was an Irish or Scottish seaman of about 27, who had, it was said, once sailed with Timothy Marr himself. He was known to have been short of money before the murders and flush with it after. He fit the shape of the thing the public needed. The maul, it was determined, may have belonged to a sailor connected to the Pear Tree lodgings, and the chain of association, thin as it was, drew tight around Williams. He was arrested and held. He never came to trial. Before the case against him could be tested in any court, before a jury could weigh whether the evidence truly reached him or merely pointed in his direction, John Williams was found hanged in his cell, dead by his own hand, or so it was recorded, and with his death the authorities and the public alike seized on the convenient conclusion. The killer had confessed by his suicide. The case was closed. The terror could end. But was it closed? Here is where this case refuses to rest quietly, and here is the question that historians have argued over for 2 centuries. The evidence against John Williams was entirely circumstantial. He had alibis for parts of the relevant time. There was no confession beyond the silence of a dead man, and a dead man cannot be cross-examined, cannot answer, cannot defend himself. A city desperate for an ending got one, and it is at least possible that the ending it got was a frightened, cornered man who died before anyone had to prove a thing. Some who have studied it since have doubted he acted alone. Some have doubted he acted at all. And that doubt has never been resolved, and now never can be, because the one man who might have answered was buried before the questions were properly asked. And how he was buried tells you what the fear had done to a supposedly rational age. John Williams was not given a grave. His body was loaded onto a cart and paraded through the streets of Wapping, past the very houses where the families had died, so that the crowds could see the face of the man they had been told was the author of their terror. And then he was taken to a crossroads and put into a hole dug too small for him, with a wooden stake driven through his heart, the ancient rite reserved for suicides and those thought too dangerous to lie easy in death, a superstition out of the deep past, enacted in the modern capital of the industrial world. They drove a stake through his heart at a London crossroads in the 19th century, because they were afraid, and they did not have anything better than fear to reach for. That is the real legacy of the Ratcliff Highway murders, and it is why this case belongs in the record beyond its horror. These killings, and the naked terror they exposed, laid bare a truth the country could no longer ignore. A modern nation, with a capital of 1 million people and the wealth of an empire flowing through its docks, had no means of protecting its own citizens beyond a few old men with lanterns and the barbaric spectacle of a stake through a corpse. The murders became a rallying point in the long argument over public safety, cited and recited in the years that followed by those who insisted that London needed a real organized, professional body of men to prevent crime and to catch those who committed it. It would take another 18 years, and it would take Robert Peel, but in 1829 the Metropolitan Police was established, the first force of its kind, the ancestor of every police service in the English-speaking world. The men we still call bobbies, after Peel, trace their lineage in part to the fear that began on a December night on the Ratcliff Highway. It should not require the slaughter of a family and their 3-month-old child to teach a nation to guard its people. But that, too often, is the price at which such lessons are bought. There is one more question I cannot leave alone, and I would like to know what you make of it, so tell me below. If John Williams did not do it, or did not do it alone, then the man who crossed a room to cut a sleeping infant's throat was never caught, was never even sought again once the cart rolled and the stake went in, and lived out his days somewhere in that dark warren by the docks, protected by nothing more than a city's desperate need to believe the matter finished, which is worse to sit with, that they buried the right man like an animal without ever proving his guilt, or that they buried the wrong one and let the true killer walk. The Ratcliff Highway is still there, though it goes by another name now, and the shop fronts and lodging houses of Marr's Wapping have been swept away by 2 centuries of demolition and dock and rebuilding. The Pear Tree is gone, the King's Arms is gone, the crossroads where they staked John Williams into the ground, was dug up long afterward by men laying a gas main, and a skeleton was found there, and the story goes that the landlord of a nearby public house kept the skull for a time, a relic of the horror passed from hand to hand. The record holds the coroner's findings, the magistrate's papers, the reward bills, the newspaper columns that carried the panic to every corner of the land, and the record holds their names. Timothy Marr, a young man who went to sea and came back with a plan and a wife and a shop of his own. Celia Marr, who had given birth 14 weeks before and was too weak yet for anything but oysters and rest. James Gowan, an apprentice boy learning a trade he would never practice, and Timothy Marr, the younger, aged 14 weeks, who had been alive in this world for the length of one autumn. They died within a bolted door that they believed would keep them safe, in a city that had given them nothing else to trust. Margaret Jewell lived. She lived a long time, they say, the girl who went out for oysters and came back to knock on the door of a house where everyone was already dead. And I have often wondered what she heard, in the years afterward, whenever she stood at any door in the dark and raised her hand to knock, and no one for a moment came to answer.